Chapter 1. The Wedding in Darkness. The wedding dress clung tightly to Elizabeth Monroe's body, its layers of fine white lace hugging her skin, beautiful yet heavy, like a reminder of the fate pressing down on her shoulders. Each step she took on the luxurious red carpet stretching through the grand London church echoed with a small, feeble sound, as if swallowed by the vast, eerily silent space. The ancient church, with its cold gray stone walls and towering columns reaching up to the vaulted ceiling, didn't feel like a place to bless love, but rather a colossal tomb bearing her last hopes. The flickering light from candles on brass stands only served to highlight the surrounding darkness, while the whispers of the guests, members of London's elite, hummed like distant bees, carrying an air of curiosity and judgment. Elizabeth, 22 years old, had never imagined her life would fall into a script like this. She'd grown up in a small house on the outskirts of London, where peaceful afternoons passed with the chirping of sparrows in the garden and the smell of her mother's freshly baked bread wafting from the kitchen. Her mother died when she was young, leaving her with her father, Henry Monroe, an ambitious but unlucky businessman. His failed investments had dragged the family into a chasm of debt, and now he was a mere shadow of the strong man he once was, his gaunt face and empty eyes fixed on her as he handed her over to Damien Carter, CEO of Carter Enterprises, a financial conglomerate worth billions of pounds, a man she'd never met before today. This marriage wasn't her choice, but a cold transaction, her in exchange for erasing her father's massive debt, keeping him out of prison. She walked slowly, her white silk shoes pinching her feet, each step pulling an invisible chain behind her. The dress, though exquisitely tailored by a renowned designer, didn't make her feel like a bride, but like a sacrificial offering, adorned splendidly before being laid on the altar. The crowd in the polished wooden pews watched her, women in expensive evening gowns whispering to each other, their sharp eyes slicing through the thin veil covering her face. "Who's that girl?" "Probably another one of Carter's deals. Look at her. Poor thing, but she deserves it." The words reached her ears, faint like the wind, yet enough to tighten her chest. They knew. All of them knew this wasn't a love story, but a contract wrapped in silk and candlelight. Elizabeth lifted her head, trying to take a deep breath to stop her hands from trembling, and her gaze met the man standing at the end of the aisle, Damien Carter. He was tall, imposing, in a perfectly tailored black suit that hugged his solid frame. His jet black hair was neatly combed back, revealing a face as cold as if carved from marble, beautiful but devoid of warmth. His eyes, deep and dark like a bottomless abyss, didn't look at her. They stared straight ahead, icy and unmoving, as if she didn't exist, as if this moment were just an annoying formality in his busy schedule. Damien Carter, a name both revered and feared in London, heir to a financial empire spanning continents, was now her husband, a husband she didn't want, and one who, it seemed, didn't need her either. The organ's notes rang out, low and mournful like a funeral dirge, pulling her from her chaotic thoughts. The priest, an elderly man with silver hair and a dry voice, began the ceremony. Elizabeth stood beside Damien, close enough to catch the faint scent of his expensive cologne, sandalwood mixed with a hint of mint, luxurious yet distant. He stood rigid like a statue, not once turning to her, showing no sign he acknowledged her presence. The space between them, though just a few inches, felt like an uncrossable ocean. "Damien Carter, do you take Elizabeth Monroe to be your lawful wedded wife, to have and to hold, in riches or in poverty, in sickness or in health, until death do you part?" the priest asked, his voice echoing in the silent expanse. A heavy silence stretched out, tight like a noose around her neck. Elizabeth held her breath, a wild spark of hope flaring in her chest. Maybe he'd refuse. Maybe he'd turn and walk away, giving her back her freedom. But then his voice cut through, low, cold and unwavering. "I do." Those two words struck like a hammer, shattering her last illusions. No emotion, no warmth, just a mechanical response, like signing a business deal. It was her turn. "Elizabeth Monroe, do you take Damien Carter to be your lawful wedded husband, to have and to hold, in riches or in poverty, in sickness or in health, until death do you part?" The priest turned to her, his eyes seeming to hold a trace of pity. Her mouth went dry, her tongue heavy as lead. 1,000 thoughts raced through her mind. Run, scream, tear off this dress and bolt from the church. But then she glanced at the front pew, where her father sat, his face bowed, his trembling hands clutching his knees. If she refused, he'd go to prison. Their family would crumble completely. She had no choice. "I do," she whispered, her voice so soft it was nearly drowned by the organ, her hands gripping the wedding bouquet so tightly that the white carnations crumpled. The rings were exchanged, cold as ice when Damien slid one onto her ring finger. His touch brushed her skin, but there was no warmth, no gentle squeeze, no hint that this was a sacred moment. He did it with the precision of a machine, withdrawing his hand instantly, as if afraid the contact might linger too long. Elizabeth placed a ring on his finger, her hands shaking, the gleaming gold bands sliding on like a mark of the bond neither of them wanted. "You may now kiss the bride," the priest declared, and Elizabeth's heart skipped a beat. For the first time since she entered the church, Damien turned to look at her. His eyes met hers, cold and piercing, like an invisible blade slicing through her fragile defenses. He leaned down, slowly, and his lips brushed her cheek, a fleeting touch, not a kiss, devoid of affection, just a formality to end the ceremony. His breath grazed her skin, cool and unfamiliar. Then he turned away at once, as if she'd vanished from his sight the moment it ended. Applause rose from the crowd, polite but lukewarm, like a play where everyone knew the ending. Elizabeth stood there, her feet frozen, her heart pounding, not with joy, but with fear and suffocation. She was a bride, but not in any dream she'd ever had. She was a traded good, a signature on paper that Damien Carter accepted with an impassive face. As they left the church, curious stares and whispers clung to her like ghosts. Damien led her to a sleek black Bentley waiting outside, his hand hovering behind her back but not truly touching, more an escort than a husband. The car door shut, the sound sharp like a coffin lid closing, and the vehicle rolled through London's misty streets. Elizabeth sat still, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, the ring on her finger glinting like a warning. Outside, a light rain began to fall, droplets streaking down the window like tears, blending with the pale golden streetlights into hazy streaks. In the confined space of the car, the silence between them was stifling. Damien sat beside her, just a small distance away, but it felt like he was in another world. He stared ahead, his hands resting calmly on his knees, the gold ring on his finger flashing whenever light passed over it. Elizabeth glanced at him, searching for a sign, a furrowed brow, a tilt of the head, anything to understand the man who was now her husband. But he remained still, his sharp face expressionless, like a statue carved from ice. She thought he'd stay indifferent, that the night would pass in the coldness she'd braced herself for. She imagined stepping into his home, surely a lavish but soulless place, where he'd leave her in some corner, as he'd done throughout the ceremony. But as the car turned down a narrow street, the streetlights casting a slant across his face, Elizabeth noticed his dark eyes weren't fixed ahead anymore. They flicked to her, just for a moment, so quick she almost thought she'd imagined it. But that look, deep, sharp, and carrying something unnameable, made the air in the car tense, heavy, like an invisible current sparking through. "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice small and trembling, breaking the oppressive silence. It was the first time she'd spoken to him since the vows, and she regretted it instantly when he didn't answer right away. Damien turned his head, looking at her for the first time since they'd entered the car. His eyes locked onto hers, not with a husband's tenderness, but with a cold appraisal, as if weighing whether she was worth his words. "My place," he finally said, his voice low and dry, devoid of emotion. He turned back to the window, as if the conversation ended before it began. But the way he spoke, short, decisive, with a hint of sharpness, sent a chill down Elizabeth's spine. This wasn't a home, she thought, but a domain, a place where he was king, and she was just a stranger stepping in. The car rolled on through London's streets, the steady patter of rain on the roof like a mournful tune. Elizabeth looked out the window, watching the towering buildings give way to narrower, quieter roads leading to the city center. She knew they were heading to Damien's penthouse, a place she'd only heard rumors about, luxurious, modern, and as cold as the man himself. But when her gaze drifted to him again, she noticed his hand, once resting calmly on his knee, now clenched tight, the knuckles whitening as if holding something back. It was the only sign he wasn't as detached as she'd thought, and it made her heart beat faster, not with hope, but with a premonition that everything was about to change. They stopped before a skyscraper, the lobby lights spilling out, illuminating Damien's face for a moment. He opened his door, stepped out without a word, then came around to her side. When the door opened, he offered his hand, but not with a husband's gentleness, rather with the stiffness of duty fulfilled. Elizabeth took it, feeling the cold touch of his long fingers, and stepped out. The rain still fell, wetting the hem of her dress, but she didn't feel the cold. Only the growing tension in her chest, signaling that tonight, whether she wanted it or not, wouldn't pass in the indifference she'd expected. Welcome to Soul Stories. Life can be overwhelming, but here we share heartfelt tales to bring you peace, joy, and inspiration. Your support, every comment, like, and follow means the world to us. It motivates us to create more meaningful and uplifting stories just for you. Did our latest story touch your heart? Leave a "I am happy" in the comments if you agree. Subscribe now and be part of a community that spreads love, kindness, and positivity. Let's make every day a little brighter together. Chapter 2. The First Night and Possession. Damien's penthouse perched atop the highest floor of a glass and steel tower in central London, a luxurious yet frigid space as if carved from icy stone. The white marble floor stretched out, so polished it reflected every beam from the modern pendant lights dangling from the lofty ceiling, casting faint, blurred streaks like cuts on ice. The minimalist decor was stark: a long black leather sofa with sharp lines, a low glass table without a single scratch, a few abstract paintings hung on cold white walls, offering no trace of a real home's warmth. Giant glass windows spanning from floor to ceiling opened onto a view of London shrouded in thick fog, where streetlights and towering buildings blurred into hazy dots of light, as if the city floated in an indistinct dream. Elizabeth stood silently in the vast living room, her pristine white wedding dress still clinging to her body, now heavy like a cold reminder of the day she'd just endured. The day she became the wife of Damien Blackwood, a man she knew only through brief encounters, distant glances, and a marriage contract drafted with the ruthless precision of a business deal. Damien stood a few steps away, his tall frame still impeccable in the black suit that had weathered the long ceremony. His gray eyes, sharp as forged steel, slid over her slowly, as if appraising a precious item he'd acquired at an immeasurable cost. He removed his overcoat, his movements deliberate and measured, hanging it on a metal rack near the door, before turning back to her. Light from the crystal chandelier overhead spilled down, highlighting his angular face. The chiseled jawline, thin lips always pressed tight as if concealing all emotion, and eyes deep as a boundless abyss. His voice sounded low and even, but devoid of warmth. "Your room is on the left, second one." No explanation, no smile, just a curt instruction, as if he were addressing a servant rather than his newlywed wife. Elizabeth nodded faintly, her hands instinctively gripping the edge of her dress, trembling fingers trying to maintain calm despite the storm of confusion, anxiety, and vague fear raging within her. She stepped past him, the click of her high heels ringing sharply on the marble floor, each step seeming to widen the distance between them in this vast, empty space. Her private room lay at the end of a dim hallway, smaller than the living room, but still bearing Damien's cold imprint. A large bed with crisp white sheets, not a wrinkle in sight, sat in the center like a solitary island. A transparent glass wardrobe revealed a few pre-hung outfits inside, and a wide window overlooked the city. Everything pristine, orderly to the point of lifelessness, as if no one had ever lived here. Elizabeth closed the door, leaning her back against the cool wooden surface, exhaling a long breath as if to dispel the pressure weighing on her chest since morning. She shed her wedding dress, the layers of smooth white silk falling to the floor with soft rustles, like fragments of memories from the ceremony just past. the dry vows echoing in the frigid church. Damien's detached gaze as he slipped the ring onto her finger, and his cold, almost mechanical handshake as they left amid the polite applause of the guests. In the wardrobe, she found a thin ivory silk nightgown, surely prepared by one of Damien's staff. She slipped it on, feeling the fabric glide over her skin, cool as a careless caress. But it wasn't enough to banish the chill seeping into her every fiber, her every vein. She climbed into bed, pulling the covers up to her chin, seeking some comfort in this newfound solitude. Her eyes closed, her weary body sinking into sleep, a temporary escape from a reality she wasn't ready to face. But she hadn't fully drifted into dreams when the door swung open, a small but sharp sound jolting her from the fragile edge between wakefulness and sleep. Elizabeth sat up abruptly, the blanket sliding down to reveal her bare shoulders and the slight rise of her chest beneath the thin silk. In the faint light spilling from the hallway, she saw Damien standing at the threshold, his appearance starkly different from the cold man who'd directed her earlier. His white shirt was unbuttoned at the top 3 buttons, exposing a firm chest with a faintly tanned hue, his black tie hanging loose around his neck as if yanked free in a moment of irritation or impatience. His usually meticulously combed black hair was slightly tousled, a few strands falling over his forehead, obscuring part of his face. But what chilled her was his eyes. A mysterious fire blazed within them, intense and hungry, as if he were no longer the Damien Blackwood of the marriage contract, but a man driven by something deep and uncontrollable, beyond the restraint he'd always imposed on himself. He stepped into the room, each move slow but deliberate, his black leather shoes clicking softly on the stone floor, every sound like a beat quickening her pulse. Elizabeth clutched the blanket tightly, her heart pounding in her chest, unsure what to do or say. She wanted to ask why he was here, to push him out and preserve her last shred of private space, but his eyes locked onto hers, holding her still like prey, mesmerized by a predator. Damien stopped at the bed's edge, leaning down to look at her, his breath carrying a faint whiff of whiskey mingled with the warm, woody scent of his cologne, an aroma both alluring and dangerous. His voice dropped low, almost a whisper, but each word fell heavy like stones into a still lake. "How do you think I could sleep knowing you belong to me?" It wasn't a question, but a declaration, a truth he'd just realized within himself, a flame that had smoldered through the ceremony, through the days he'd signed the contract with her father, now flaring up beyond containment. Elizabeth had no time to reply, to grasp the full meaning of his words or muster a retort, before Damien acted. He reached out, strong yet not rough, seizing her wrist and pulling her from the bed with just enough force to leave her no chance to resist. The blanket fell to the floor, leaving her standing exposed in the thin silk nightgown, her body trembling from the room's cold and the shock of his actions. He pushed her back, step by step, until her back met the cool stone wall behind her, his breath hot and urgent against her cheek, a stark contrast to the chill enveloping her. Before she could protest or utter a word, his lips found hers, a kiss fierce and almost possessive, as if claiming a right the contract alone could never define. Elizabeth panicked for a moment, her heart racing wildly, her mind spinning as if caught in a tidal wave. She was inexperienced, never drawn into a moment this intense. Her past kisses had been gentle, clumsy touches with college boys, nothing like Damien's strength and determination. But his pull, the power in his every move, the mystery in his gaze, and a vague hint of vulnerability buried in how he kissed her, swept her into a whirlwind of emotion she couldn't resist, despite her reasons screaming to push him away. That night, they crossed the boundary of strangers, stepping into a world neither had prepared for. The first time, Damien was gentler than she'd expected, his hands gliding over her body as if exploring new territory, each touch slow, almost cautious, as if afraid she'd shatter under his strength. Elizabeth, though steeped in fear and awkwardness, gradually relaxed, letting him guide her, letting his warmth chase away the room's cold and the loneliness she'd carried from the ceremony. He whispered her name, Elizabeth, his voice hoarse, as if it now held a new meaning in his mind. She felt his every breath, every gentle caress on her skin, and though her heart still raced with unease, She couldn't deny a part of her was melting under his unexpected tenderness. But the second time, everything changed. Damien grew fervent, like a fire erupting beyond control. He pulled her closer, his hands gripping her waist tightly, each touch brimming with passion and demand, drawing her into a rhythm she couldn't fight. She sensed his strength in every motion, the burning desire in every kiss he pressed to her neck, her shoulders, as if he sought to etch his mark on every inch of her. Elizabeth was swept along, her breath ragged, her body responding instinctively, though her mind lagged behind. She feared his intensity, yet noticed something strange. She held something that made him tremble, made him lose control in every moment he held her. Between urgent breaths, he whispered in her ear, "You don't know what you do to me." His voice strong, yet laced with a fragility she'd never thought he could show. By the final time, when both were exhausted, their union transcended mere possession or passion, becoming a deeper, almost sacred connection. Damien pulled her onto the bed, his arm encircling her waist, holding her against his chest as if afraid she'd vanish if he let go. Elizabeth lay there, their breaths mingling, feeling his heart pound beneath his heated skin, each beat syncing with hers. She looked at him in the dim glow from the wide windows, the city lights filtering in like stray stars amid the thick fog. His eyes, no longer blazing as they had at first, softened, deepening, as if he too were discovering something new within himself. A shift he hadn't anticipated when he entered her room tonight. She realized this night wasn't just him possessing her. She held a power to make this cold man vulnerable, if only in the fleeting moments when he held her tighter than ever. They lay together, silent, with only the steady sound of their breathing and the distant rain echoing through the thick glass. Elizabeth gazed out at London's misty skyline through the window, the flickering lights like the city's sleeping breaths. Her body felt lighter after hours of tension, but her mind remained a tangle, reeling with mixed emotions, fear, surprise, and a hint of something like hope. She understood this marriage was no longer the cold contract she'd envisioned when she signed her name on that white paper with its dry terms. It had become something alive, an unpredictable beginning where she and Damien weren't just strangers bound by signatures, but two souls touching in a night full of emotion, contradiction, and unspoken truths. She closed her eyes, resting her head on his shoulder, feeling his warmth seep through the thin silk. For the first time since stepping into this penthouse, she felt a flicker of peace, fleeting, like the hazy glow of London outside, enough to make her believe tomorrow might be different. Chapter 3. Love blossoming between two worlds. The months following the wedding passed in Damien's cold penthouse like a slow melody, each note gradually blending into a tune neither of them had anticipated. Outside, London remained a misty tableau, its cobblestone streets slick with dampness and the sound of car horns echoing through the endless drizzle. But within the white marble walls of the apartment, a quiet transformation was unfolding. Damien Blackwood, the man once as cold as steel, who had gazed at Elizabeth with icy eyes as if she were merely a clause in their marriage contract, now began to reveal cracks in his frosty shell. Elizabeth noticed it through small, almost unintentional acts that carried profound meaning for her. One early morning, as she awoke in her private room, still steeped in the chill of stone and glass, she found a book on the bedside table, Jane Eyre, the novel she'd mentioned in passing during a brief conversation with him weeks earlier. Its cover was slightly worn, as if bought from a second-hand shop, and inside was a handwritten note in black ink. "For you, D." No explanation, no words from Damien when she asked him later, just a shrug and a fleeting glance as if to say it was no big deal. But to Elizabeth, it was the first ray of light piercing the fog between them. Then came other mornings when she stepped out of her room and caught the acrid scent of burnt toast wafting through the air. Damien, in a white shirt with rolled-up sleeves, stood in the modern kitchen with a scowl, gripping a frying pan as if it were an enemy to conquer. "I'm not good at this," he muttered as she entered, but he still set a plate of charred toast and a cup of black coffee in front of her, an awkward invitation to share breakfast. Elizabeth smiled softly, taking a bite despite its dry, bitter taste. But she didn't complain. For the first time, she saw him trying, however clumsily, to do something for her. Those moments stretched into evenings by the Thames, when Damien unexpectedly took her hand as they strolled under the soft glow of yellow streetlights. His hand was large and rough, but the grip wasn't as forced as she'd once thought. It was firm, warm, like a promise unspoken. Elizabeth gazed at the river shimmering with light, feeling his breath beside her, and wondered if this man was truly the one she'd married in that cold ceremony, or if he was slowly becoming someone else, someone she could love. Their connection didn't come instantly, but grew gradually, like water wearing down stone over time. Elizabeth began to uncover Damien through the fragments he unwittingly revealed, stories he shared in rare moments when he lowered his walls. One evening, as they sat on the sofa in the living room, the crackling fireplace casting light on his face, Damien told her about his childhood, a childhood without laughter or warm embraces. He grew up in a powerful family, where his parents, wealthy but distant entrepreneurs, forced him onto a path he couldn't refuse. "I had no choice," he said, his voice low and distant, his eyes fixed on the flames as if reliving those days. "They wanted me to be the perfect heir. No emotions, no mistakes, no weakness." But the most painful piece of his past was the story of his sister, Emily. 5 years younger than him, a blonde girl with a radiant smile he described as the only sunshine in the house. 10 years ago, on a rainy night when Damien was 22, he drove Emily home from a birthday party. The road was slick, his focus shattered by a phone argument with his father, and the car crashed into a tree. Emily didn't survive. "I heard her scream," he whispered, his hand clenching into a fist, his voice breaking with anguish. "I was supposed to protect her, but I was the one who killed her." Elizabeth sat silently, her heart tightening as she watched rare tears roll down his cheeks. A man who'd never shown a hint of vulnerability before her. From then on, she became the light to soothe his pain. She didn't try to fix him. She knew scars like that never fully healed. But she stayed by his side, listening to him on nights he woke from nightmares, her hand gripping his to pull him from the darkness. In return, Damien became her shield against the harsh world he'd once inhabited. When she faced the prying eyes of London's elite, those who called her the contract bride, or the country girl unworthy of Damien Blackwood, he stood in front of her, his voice cold but resolute. "She's my wife, and I don't want to hear another word." Elizabeth felt that protection, and for the first time, she no longer felt alone in this marriage. They began spending more time together, not just in the penthouse but beyond it. Afternoon walks through Hyde Park, where Damien bought her ice cream despite grumbling it was too sweet, or evenings when he took her to a small theater in the West End to see a play she loved. Slowly, the walls between them crumbled, not through grand declarations, but through small, genuine moments. Elizabeth realized she no longer feared him as she had at first, and Damien, though he never said it, smiled more. Rare smiles, but enough to brighten his cold gray eyes. One stormy night, as London's sky unleashed heavy raindrops that pounded the penthouse's glass windows, everything between them reached a small but meaningful climax. Elizabeth sat on the sofa, Jane Eyre open in her hands, the table lamp's light illuminating her face, highlighting gentle features Damien hadn't noticed in the early days. He entered from his study, sleeves rolled up, hair damp from standing on the balcony for a long while, as if trying to wash something from his mind. He said nothing, just stood there watching her, his eyes deep and filled with an emotion she'd never seen before. Then suddenly he knelt before her, his knees touching the cold stone floor, his hands grasping hers with a gentle desperation. "Elizabeth," he said, his voice hoarse, as if each word fought to escape his throat. "I didn't want this marriage, not at first. It was just a contract, a way to keep everything under control. But now I can't live without you." The confession cut through the armor he'd built over years, exposing the wounded heart beneath. Elizabeth looked at him, her heart racing, silent tears streaming down her cheeks. She said nothing, only leaned down, pressing her lips to his in a tender but certain kiss. A confirmation that she too had fallen for him, this complex, scarred man. The kiss lingered, not fierce like their first night, but deep and sincere, as if they were exchanging a new promise, no longer rooted in paperwork but in their hearts. When they parted, Damien pulled her into his arms, whispering, "I want a family. With you." Elizabeth smiled, nodding, and within her blossomed a dream she'd never dared imagine when she entered this marriage. Months later, she discovered she was pregnant, and when she told Damien on a peaceful morning, he stood still, then knelt again, embracing her with a joy he couldn't hide. "Our child," he whispered, his hand on her belly, and for the first time, Elizabeth saw him smile, a real, unguarded smile that lit up the frigid room. They began dreaming of a happy family, a future where the penthouse was no longer a lavish, empty space, but a true home. Elizabeth pictured a nursery with pale blue walls, a small crib, and laughter replacing the dreary sound of rain. Damien, though not adept at showing it, started making plans. He spoke of buying a house in London's outskirts, where they could raise their child in fresh air, far from the city's smoke and harshness. "I want our child to have what I never did," he said once as they lay in bed, moonlight streaming through the window onto his face. Elizabeth nodded, her hand entwined with his, feeling his warmth like a promise they'd build it together. But just as their love bloomed most vibrantly, shadows from Damien's past began to emerge, silent yet threatening. One evening, as Elizabeth read in the living room, Damien's phone rang from his study. She heard his tense voice through the half-open door. "No, I told you I'm done with that. It ended long ago." When he stepped out, his face was pale, his eyes reverting to the coldness she'd seen in the beginning. "What's wrong?" she asked, her voice worried. But he only shook his head, saying, "Nothing you need to worry about." Yet Elizabeth knew he was hiding something, a secret from his past, a ghost he'd never fully escaped, now quietly menacing everything they'd built. Chapter 4. Bankruptcy and a Fateful Turn. Damien Blackwood's penthouse had once been a symbol of power and luxury, but now, on a gloomy early winter morning, it became a silent battlefield where Carter Enterprises, the empire he'd built over 10 years, began to crumble. Beyond the expansive glass windows, London loomed in a thick fog, its high-rise buildings blurring into ghostly shapes within a nightmare. Inside, a heavy atmosphere enveloped the vast living room, where stacks of financial newspapers piled up on the glass table, each headline stabbing at Damien's pride like a knife. Carter Enterprises faces financial fraud allegations. Stocks plummet amid scandal. Damien Blackwood, from business king to swindler? Elizabeth stood in the corner, her hands cradling her 7-month pregnant belly, her green eyes watching him with worry. Damien sat on the black leather sofa, phone in hand, his voice growling through the speaker. "Find out who's behind this, now!" But deep down, he knew this enemy wouldn't be easily defeated. Victor Grayson, an old business rival of Damien's, had been quietly setting a trap for months. A tall, gaunt man with a fake smile and eyes sharp as blades, Victor had once been a partner at Carter Enterprises until Damien severed ties over irreconcilable differences. Now, fueled by a burning grudge, Victor spread rumors that Damien had embezzled millions of pounds from the company, manipulating figures to hide a massive debt. The rumors spread like wildfire through dry brush, amplified by tabloid articles and whispers in London's financial circles. Carter Enterprises' stock plummeted uncontrollably, losing 60% of its value in just 3 days. Investors, who once saw Damien as an invincible king, turned their backs, withdrawing capital at a dizzying pace. His phone rang incessantly, calls from banks demanding repayment, partners canceling contracts, lawyers warning of impending lawsuits. The conglomerate, once his pride, was drowning in debt, a giant ship sinking with no clear way to save it. Elizabeth stepped closer, placing a hand on his shoulder, her voice gentle. "Damien, you need to rest a little. I'm worried about you." But he brushed her hand away, his gray eyes tense. "Rest? When the whole world's turning against me? You wouldn't understand." She stepped back, her heart tightening at his coldness. But she didn't leave. She knew he was fighting, not just against external foes, but against his own fear within. Damien threw himself into the battle to save the company like a cornered beast. He worked day and night, sleeping only a few hours on the study sofa, his desk buried under papers and cold coffee cups. His phone never stopped ringing, his voice growing hoarse from arguments with lawyers, accountants, and the few remaining investors. "We'll sue Victor for slander," he shouted during a conference call, slamming his hand on the table. "Find every piece of evidence. I won't let him win." But each passing day worsened the situation. Banks refused to extend loans, major partners cut ties, and a wave of employees began quitting as rumors seeped into the company's ranks. Damien grew distant, no longer the man who'd held Elizabeth's hand by the Thames or whispered to her of a happy family. He was now a shadow of himself, eyes sunken from sleeplessness, his voice sharp whenever she tried to approach. Elizabeth, though 7 months pregnant and increasingly weighed down by her body, tirelessly sought ways to support him. She brewed coffee for him on late nights, draped a blanket over him when he collapsed at his desk, and even attempted to sift through complex financial documents to grasp what he faced. But every time she spoke, Damien snapped and pushed her away. One night, as she entered his study with a plate of sandwiches, he looked up from the pile of papers, eyes bloodshot. "Elizabeth, I don't need you here. You don't understand any of this. Get out." His voice cut like a blade, sharp and cold, leaving her stunned, her trembling hands dropping the plate to the floor. She stared at him, tears silently spilling over, but said nothing, turning away and cradling her belly as if shielding their unborn child from her own pain. She understood the immense pressure he was under, but the distance tore at her heart. She longed for the days they dreamed of a future together, when he gently placed his hand on her belly and called their unborn child our light. Now that light seemed to fade from his eyes, replaced by despair and anger. Elizabeth sat alone in the bedroom, gazing out at the city through the window, her hands softly rubbing her belly, whispering to the baby, "Your dad will be okay, Liam. I won't let us lose him." She'd chosen that name, Liam, because it meant strong protector, a hope that her son would bring strength to both her and Damien in this storm. But the real storm struck one rainy afternoon when all of Damien's efforts collapsed like a sandcastle before a wave. Victor Grayson, not content with rumors, teamed up with a former Carter Enterprises employee, James Carter, an accountant Damien had fired 3 years earlier for minor fraud. Harboring resentment, James supplied Victor with a slew of forged documents, fabricated transfer receipts, tampered contracts, and fake emails suggesting Damien had siphoned millions from company funds to settle personal debts. Though entirely false, the evidence was crafted with such precision that it convinced the media and investigators. One morning, police stormed Carter Enterprises' offices, ransacking every corner, seizing computers and files, while Damien stood amid the chaos, fists clenched, roaring, "This is a setup. I'll prove I'm innocent." But the fateful day arrived just days later, right at the penthouse. Elizabeth sat on the sofa, trying to knit a small woolen hat for Liam, her hands trembling from exhaustion and worry. Damien had just returned from a meeting with his lawyer, his face pale, coat still soaked from the rain. The doorbell rang, and before he could react, the door burst open, 3 uniformed officers stepping in, followed by an investigator in a gray suit. "Damien Blackwood," the lead officer said, voice hard as steel, "you're under arrest for financial embezzlement and corporate fraud. Come with us." Elizabeth sprang up, the hat falling to the floor, her hands clutching her belly, screaming in desperation. "No, he didn't do anything wrong. You've got the wrong person." She rushed to Damien, grabbing his hand, tears streaming down, but he only looked at her, his gray eyes full of pain and helplessness. The police ignored her. They handcuffed Damien, the metallic clink resounding like a final verdict. He didn't resist, only whispering to her before being led away. "Take care of yourself and the baby, Elizabeth. I'll come back." But that promise faded as the door slammed shut, leaving her in the empty room, her sobs mingling with the rain battering the windows. The trial was swift, Victor and James's fabricated evidence overwhelming Damien's lawyer's defenses. He was sentenced to 5 years in prison for a crime he didn't commit, a verdict that sent shockwaves through London. But no one cared about the truth when everyone had turned against him. At the same time, the bank, impatient with Carter Enterprises' debts, seized the penthouse. Elizabeth watched as bank officials sealed the door, her hands clutching a small bag with a few clothes and the copy of Jane Eyre Damien had given her. She had nothing left, no home, no money, only the 7-month pregnancy in her womb and a wordless ache. She was forced to move to a cramped, run-down apartment in East London, a damp neighborhood with stained walls and the sound of arguments drifting from next door. The apartment had one narrow bedroom, a tiny kitchen with a rusted sink, and a window overlooking a trash-strewn alley. Elizabeth sat on the creaking old bed, rubbing her belly, telling herself, "I can do this. For Liam. For Damien." 3 months later, in a crowded East London public hospital, Elizabeth gave birth to a boy amid wrenching pain and a loneliness no one shared. Liam's cries echoed in the shabby delivery room, a sound both fragile and strong, like a beam of light piercing the darkness of her life now. She held him close, tears rolling down as she saw eyes, blue like Damien's, open for the first time. "Liam," she whispered, naming him as she'd promised herself, "You'll be my protector, and I'll protect you." A nurse handed her a plastic bracelet reading Liam Blackwood, which she slipped onto his wrist, a vow that nothing would tear their family apart. Elizabeth returned to the rundown apartment, Liam in her arms, resolved to raise him alone and wait for Damien. She took a part-time job at a nearby grocery store, though her body was still weak from childbirth, and spent long nights by the window, gazing into the dark alley, singing to Liam in a trembling voice, "Hush, little baby, don't say a word." But her heart ached with loss of the home that had been their haven, the man she loved, and the dream of a happy family they'd painted together. In prison, Damien was likely counting the days, but she didn't know if he'd still be the man she loved when he returned, or if the darkness of these years would change him forever. She looked at Liam sleeping in her arms, his eyes closed, his tiny face peaceful amid life's storm. "I'll wait for your dad," she whispered, tears falling onto her cheeks. "No matter how long it takes." But deep inside, she knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, and the shadows of Damien's past, of which Victor was only a part, still lurked, waiting to drag them down once more. Chapter 5. 2 Years in Darkness. Elizabeth's cramped, rundown apartment in East London was a world apart from the lavish penthouse she'd once shared with Damien. Each morning, as faint dawn light filtered through the cracked, murky window, she woke on the creaky old bed, her body aching from a restless night interrupted by the drip of rain leaking through the roof onto the rotting wooden floor. The air in the apartment was always damp, carrying the musty smell of stained walls and the smoke from the alley outside, where garbage trucks rumbled by regularly. The furnishings were so worn they seemed on the verge of collapse. A wobbly, small wooden table, a chair with torn fabric upholstery, and a rusted gas stove she had to light 3 times to ignite. Yet amid this decay, one item on the wooden table never changed. Her wedding photo with Damien, set in a cheap plastic frame she'd bought from a convenience store. In the picture, Damien stood tall in a flawless black suit, his gray eyes cold but with a fleeting hint of tenderness as he looked at her, while she beamed radiantly in her pristine white gown. That photo was her sole flame of hope, a reminder that no matter how harsh her current life became, she still had him, though he was in a place she couldn't reach. Elizabeth worked at a grocery store a few streets from the apartment, a low-paying job but enough to support Liam, her and Damien's 2-year-old son. Every day she stood behind the counter for 8 hours, her feet throbbing from the cold concrete floor, her hands deftly packing goods for hurried customers, struggling laborers, single mothers like her, and occasionally grumbling drunks who complained about her slowness. The meager wages barely covered rent, milk, and bread for Liam, but she didn't complain. She worked with a quiet determination, her green eyes always shining with a resolve no one could extinguish. When the store's owner, a gaunt middle-aged man named Alf, asked why she didn't give up and find another man, she only smiled faintly. "I already have my man, Alf. He'll come back." Alf shook his head, muttering something about pipe dreams. But Elizabeth didn't care. She had Liam, and she had Damien in her heart, even though he was hundreds of miles away, behind prison bars. She spent every evening with Liam, playing with him on the tattered rug spread across the floor, singing lullabies she made up, her voice hoarse but warm. "Sleep, my little Liam, under London's sky." Liam, with his black hair and blue eyes just like Damien's, was her only lifeline through these 2 dark years. He'd laugh loudly when she lifted him high, his tiny arms wrapping around her neck, but sometimes he'd fall silent, staring at the wedding photo on the table with a curious look she couldn't answer. She kept Liam close, as if he were the anchor keeping her from being swept away in the storm of her present life. Meanwhile, far from East London, Damien Blackwood lived in a different world, a frigid prison on England's outskirts, where sunlight rarely breached the gray concrete walls. 2 years in jail had transformed him into a different man, no longer the powerful businessman who'd stood atop London's heights. He'd grown thin, his angular face now gaunt, his gray eyes sunken from sleeplessness, and a lingering pain that never faded. The faded gray prison uniform hung loosely on his frame, an insult to the man who'd once worn only bespoke suits from Savile Row. But the worst wasn't the prison's harsh conditions, the tasteless meals, the stone-hard bed, or the shouts of other inmates at night. It was the torment from his cellmates. Damien's wealthy past made him a target in prison. The other inmates, from petty thieves to violent thugs, saw him as the fallen millionaire, a man who deserved punishment for living in luxury while they'd scrape by outside. They mocked him, calling him the king without a throne, and more than once attacked him in the prison's shadowy corners. A punch to the gut as he passed through a hallway, a cut from a makeshift knife on his arm during labor hours. Damien didn't fight back much. He learned to stay silent, to lower his head to survive. But each bruise on his body was a deeper gash in the once inviolable pride he'd carried. He wrote to Elizabeth every week, sitting in his dim cell with a blunt pencil and crumpled paper, each line an effort to cling to his last shred of hope. "Elizabeth, I'm still okay. Take care of Liam and yourself. I'll come back," he wrote. But those letters rarely reached her. The prison's mail system was shoddy, letters lost or held back by guards for unclear reasons. When no replies came, Damien began to lose faith. He sat in the corner of his cell, staring at the concrete wall, wondering if Elizabeth still waited for him. "She's given up on me," he whispered in the dark, his voice faltering with pain and loneliness. He imagined her living a new life, with another man, Liam calling someone else dad instead of him. The thought stabbed his heart like a knife, deeper than any wound from the other prisoners. But Damien didn't know that Elizabeth had never stopped waiting. His letters, though seldom reaching her, were treasures she kept in an old tin box under the bed. She reread them on rainy nights when Liam slept, tears falling silently as she touched his scrawled words. "I'm still okay," she whispered to herself, though she knew it might be a lie he wrote to comfort her. She couldn't visit him. The money from the grocery store only stretched to daily survival, not enough for the long trip to the prison or to hire someone to watch Liam. But she didn't give up. Every day she lived with the hope that he'd return, that they'd be a family again like before. The climax of these 2 dark years came on a frigid winter afternoon, as rain poured relentlessly onto the leaky roof of Elizabeth's apartment. She'd just returned from her shift, clothes soaked, holding Liam wrapped in a thin blanket to shield him from the cold seeping in. The apartment was quiet, save for the rain hammering the tin roof and Liam's soft humming of a children's song she taught him. Elizabeth was warming milk for him when a knock sounded at the door, firm and deliberate, unlike the gentle taps of the neighbor who sometimes brought leftover bread. She opened it, and there stood Victor Grayson. Victor, in an expensive gray suit and a long waterproof coat, looked out of place in East London's squalid alley. His fake smile chilled her, his knife-sharp eyes sweeping over her and Liam with unconcealed contempt. "Elizabeth Blackwood," he said, his voice smooth but venomous. "You look more pathetic than I imagined." She tightened her grip around Liam, her tone firm. "What do you want, Victor?" He stepped inside uninvited, his polished shoes leaving mud on her floor. "I'm here to help you," he said, pulling a thick stack of cash from his pocket and setting it on the rickety wooden table. "You and the kid need money. I'll provide for you. A house, clothes, a good school for Liam. All you have to do is abandon Damien. Publicly say you're done with him." Elizabeth stared at the money, then at Victor, her heart pounding with fury. She set Liam down on the chair, stepping toward him, her green eyes blazing. "Who do you think I am? A dog you can buy off with cash?" Victor smirked. "I think you're practical. Damien won't get out of prison anytime soon. I'll make sure of it. Do you want the kid growing up in this rat hole?" His words cut like a knife, but Elizabeth didn't waver. She snatched the glass of water from the table and flung it at his face, water splashing across his costly suit. "I'd rather die than betray him," she shouted, her voice trembling with anger and tears. "Get out of my house now!" Victor wiped his face, his smile vanishing, replaced by a cold glare. "You'll regret this, Elizabeth. I'll make sure Damien never gets out. You and the kid will have nothing." He turned and walked out, leaving his threat hanging in the air. Elizabeth slammed the door behind him, leaning against the wall, gasping for breath. Liam, now sitting on the chair, looked at her with wide eyes, his childish voice ringing out. "Where's Dad, Mommy?" The innocent question shattered her heart, like a dagger plunging into the pain she tried to bury. She knelt and hugged him, tears spilling over. "Dad's far away, sweetheart, but he'll come back, I promise." That night the rain fell ceaselessly, leaking through the roof and dripping onto the floor, forming a small puddle beside the bed where Elizabeth and Liam lay. She held him as he slept, his tiny body curled in her arms, his steady breathing the only thing keeping her sane amid the storm of pain and despair. The wedding photo on the table blurred in the dim glow of an oil lamp, but she could still see Damien's smile in it, a smile she feared he'd lost in the prison's darkness. "Dad will come back, sweetheart," she whispered, her trembling voice blending with the rain. "I promise." But inside, fear grew quietly. Fear that Victor would keep his threat. Fear that Damien wouldn't be the man she'd loved when he returned. And fear that these 2 years in darkness were just the start of greater trials ahead. Chapter 6. Reunion and a New Beginning. One early spring morning, London's sky finally shed its thick fog, revealing faint rays of sunlight that spilled onto the cobblestone streets. After 2 years confined in the darkness of prison, Damien Blackwood stepped out from behind the heavy iron gate, no longer the powerful man who'd once stood at the pinnacle of Carter Enterprises. He was gaunt, the faded gray prison uniform hanging loosely on a frame once solid. His black hair now long and tangled, brushing his shoulders and partly concealing a haggard face marked by small scars from those harsh days. But his gray eyes, though sunken from sleeplessness and pain, still burned with a fire no one could extinguish. The determination to reclaim his family, to find Elizabeth and Liam, the ones who'd kept him alive through the endless nights behind bars. Damien was released early thanks to an unexpected turn. A young lawyer, Michael Reed, who'd worked at Carter Enterprises before its collapse, refused to abandon the fight to clear his name. After months of investigation, Michael uncovered evidence that Victor Grayson had fabricated documents to frame Damien, fake emails, falsified transfer receipts, and the testimony of James Carter, the man who'd betrayed him, all proven false through secret recordings Michael obtained from an inside source. The court reopened the case, and within weeks, Damien was declared innocent, Victor arrested for slander and fraud, and James faced charges for perjury. As the prison gate swung open, Damien carried nothing but a small canvas bag holding a few old letters he'd written to Elizabeth, letters he wasn't sure she'd received, and a promise to himself. He wouldn't lose his family again. He stood still under the weak sunlight, breathing the air of freedom for the first time in 2 years, but his mind wasn't there. It had already flown to East London, where Elizabeth and Liam lived. He had no money, no car, only a cheap bus ticket Michael had given him before they parted. "Go find her," Michael said, clapping his shoulder with a smile. "She's been waiting for you a long time." Damien nodded, silent, but inside him surged a wave of emotions. Joy, anxiety, and a vague fear that Elizabeth might no longer need him. He boarded the bus sitting in the back row, peering through the cloudy window as the city rolled by. Each street bringing him closer to the family he'd dreamed of 1,000 times in those lonely nights behind bars. East London appeared before him with its narrow alleys, weathered buildings stained with age, and the mingled smells of exhaust and dampness from recent rains. Damien stepped off the bus, his tattered shoes squelching on the wet pavement, his hand gripping the canvas bag as if clinging to his last ounce of strength. He'd gotten Elizabeth's address from Michael, a small apartment in the impoverished neighborhood she'd moved to after the penthouse was seized. When he found the low-rise building with peeling paint on its walls, his heart pounded, each step up the rotting wooden stairs stretching the anticipation and worry within him. At the door of apartment number 7, Damien paused, his hand trembling as it rested on the chipped wooden surface. Through a small crack, he heard Elizabeth's voice, a gentle, hoarse lullaby, warm despite its roughness. "Sleep, my little Liam, under London's sky." Her voice washed over him like a balm, soothing the bleeding heart he'd carried for 2 years. He leaned in, peering through the gap, and the sight before him brought tears he couldn't hold back. Elizabeth sat on an old chair, Liam cradled in her lap, his eyes closed in sleep, his messy black hair resting against her chest. She wore a thin, threadbare sweater, her face thinner but still gently beautiful as the day he'd first met her. Beside her, on a wobbly wooden table, sat their wedding photo, its cheap plastic frame wiped spotless, a tiny flame flickering amid the ruin of this dilapidated apartment. Damien knocked softly but enough for her to hear. Elizabeth's singing stopped. She looked up, carefully setting Liam on the chair, then walked to the door. When it swung open and she saw him, time seemed to freeze. Elizabeth stood stunned, her green eyes wide, her mouth open but wordless. Damien stood there, thin and ragged, but his eyes locked onto hers, brimming with love and pain. "Elizabeth," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. She didn't wait a second longer, rushing into his arms, holding him tight as if afraid he'd vanish again. "You're back," she cried, tears soaking his shoulder, her body shaking in his embrace. Damien hugged her back, his hands gripping her tightly, breathing in her familiar scent, cheap soap mixed with her warmth, as if it were the only medicine that could heal his scars. "I'm back," he repeated, his voice breaking, tears falling into her hair. "I'm sorry, Elizabeth. I'm sorry for leaving you alone." They stood there embracing in the doorway, their sobs mingling with the wind whistling through the alley outside. 2 years of separation, 2 years of pain, dissolved in this moment of reunion, as if all the darkness they'd faced was just a long dream they'd finally woken from. When they parted, Elizabeth wiped her tears and pulled Damien into the small apartment. He stepped inside, his eyes scanning the squalid space, the stained walls, the leaky roof with a small puddle on the floor, the creaky old bed where Liam slept. But his gaze stopped when he saw the boy, his heart pounding as if it might burst. Liam, now 2, lay curled on the chair, his tiny hands clutching a tattered stuffed bear Elizabeth had sewn for him. Damien knelt beside him, his trembling hand touching the soft black hair of his son, the boy's face strikingly like his own. Blue eyes, sharp features, but with an innocence he'd long lost. Liam stirred, opening his eyes, looking at Damien with a mix of curiosity and shyness. Elizabeth sat beside them, whispering, "Liam, this is your dad." The boy blinked, glancing from her to him, then suddenly said, his young voice clear, "Dad?" The word struck Damien's heart like a sweet blade, bringing him fully to his knees on the floor, pulling Liam into his arms with all the love and pain of 2 years apart. "Yes, son," he whispered, tears spilling again. "It's Dad. Dad won't ever leave you again, I promise." Liam, still shy, wrapped his small arms around his neck, and in that moment, Damien felt every wound inside him begin to heal, bit by bit. Elizabeth sat close, holding his hand, smiling through her tears. They began recounting the months apart. She spoke of grueling days at the grocery store, nights cradling Liam under the leaking roof, and how she kept their wedding photo as a flame of hope. Damien told her of prison days, the letters he wrote that never reached her, and the fear she'd given up on him. "I thought you didn't need me anymore," he said, his voice low with pain. Elizabeth shook her head, squeezing his hand. "Never, Damien. I promised I'd wait for you, and I kept my word." He leaned down to kiss her, a kiss tender but profound, as if affirming that their love, tested by darkness, had been mended through the scars they both bore. Months later, Damien and Elizabeth's little family left East London, moving to a modest house in the suburbs an hour from the city. The house was bought with compensation from the lawsuit against Victor Grayson, now facing a long prison term for slander and document fraud. It was a simple wooden home with a red-tiled roof, surrounded by a small garden of weeds and lavender. Elizabeth began tending. Gone was the penthouse's grandeur, but it was a true home, where Liam's laughter rang out instead of dreary rain, where sunlight streamed through wooden windows instead of the city's cold lights. With Michael's help, Damien opened a small coffee shop in the nearby town, naming it Liam's Brew. He stood behind the counter daily, brewing coffee with a charming clumsiness Elizabeth once teased him for, but customers loved his sincerity. Elizabeth, meanwhile, started teaching local children at home, turning the small living room into a colorful classroom with a blackboard and books. She taught them to read, write, and shared stories she'd once told Liam, her eyes lighting up whenever the kids laughed. Together with Liam, they built a simple but fulfilling life. Each evening, Damien and Elizabeth sat on the porch, watching Liam romp in the garden, chasing butterflies or tumbling onto the grass with peals of laughter. He held her hand, whispering, "I never thought I deserved this. You and Liam." Elizabeth smiled, resting her head on his shoulder. "We deserve it, Damien." After everything, we found each other. Under the clear suburban sky, they were no longer a millionaire and a contract bride, but a family, a new beginning forged from the shards of their past, bound by love and unyielding resilience. Damien and Elizabeth's story isn't just a romantic tale, but a journey of growth, hope, and renewal. From the scars of their past, they built a new start together, simple yet complete, proving that love, family, and resilience can overcome any darkness. The greatest lesson might be this: no matter how harsh life becomes, as long as you have those you love beside you, every new beginning is worth it. Damien was no longer the cold millionaire. Elizabeth no longer the contract bride. They were a family, and that was the most precious thing they found after it all. Thank you for following this heartfelt story of Soul Stories channel. Share your thoughts about the story in the comments below. If you believe that true love can withstand all trials and sometimes begins in the simplest of ways, don't forget to hit the like button and share this story with your friends. To never miss out on touching and meaningful stories, subscribe to our channel and help us spread messages of love and warmth to everyone. Let's cherish the beautiful moments of life and love together.